The woman who refused to leave. In 1983, the United States government made a rare decision. It would buy an entire town. Times Beach, Missouri, a small working-class community along Route 66, had been declared contaminated with dangerous levels of dioxin, a toxic byproduct of chemical waste. Federal authorities determined that long-term exposure posed serious health risks. The safest solution, they concluded, was evacuation. One by one, families accepted government buyouts. Houses were emptied, mailboxes stood unused, curtains stopped moving in the windows. By the mid-1980s, Times Beach was no longer functioning as a town. It was becoming something else, a memory in slow motion. But not everyone left. Amid boarded-up homes and growing silence, one resident chose to remain, even as officials urged relocation and demolition plans advanced. She did not organize protests, she did not seek headlines, she simply stayed. Her decision raised a quiet question that rarely makes national news. When a place is declared unsafe, what defines home? Soil, structure, or something deeper? To understand why she refused to leave, we need to step back to the origins of Times Beach and the chain of events that transformed an ordinary American town into a national environmental case study.
Times Beach was founded in 1925 as a promotional project along the Merrimack River, about 17 miles southwest of St. Louis, Missouri. The St. Louis Star-Times newspaper offered parcels of land for $67.50 to subscribers who purchased a 6-month subscription. For many working-class families, it was an affordable path to property ownership. Over the decades, the town evolved into a modest residential community. By the 1970s, roughly 2,000 people lived there. It was not wealthy nor widely known. It was the kind of place built on routine, shift work in nearby industries, children riding bicycles on unpaved roads, summer humidity rising from the riverbanks. Those unpaved roads would later become central to the town's fate. In the early 1970s, Times Beach officials hired a waste hauler named Russell Bliss to spray oil on the dirt streets to control dust, a common practice in small towns at the time. What residents did not know was that some of the oil he applied was contaminated with dioxin, a highly toxic compound associated with industrial chemical production. At first, there were no alarms, no dramatic warnings, just dust settling more heavily than before. It would take years and mounting evidence from other contaminated sites in Missouri before state and federal agencies began testing the soil in Times Beach. And when the results came back, they would change everything. By the mid-1970s, concerns about dioxin contamination were no longer isolated incidents in Missouri. Several sites connected to the same waste oil hauler had begun drawing state attention. In 1971, a horse arena in St. Louis County, later known as the Shenandoah Stables site, experienced unexplained animal deaths after being sprayed with contaminated oil. Investigations eventually traced the source back to industrial waste mixed into Bliss's hauling operations. These earlier cases prompted broader soil testing across locations where his oil had been applied, including Times Beach. In 1982, the Environmental Protection Agency conducted tests throughout the town. The findings showed elevated levels of dioxin in multiple areas, particularly along roadways and residential properties. That same year, severe flooding from the Merrimack River disrupted the soil even further, spreading contaminated sediment across yards and inside homes. The town was already economically fragile. The flood left many houses damaged and temporarily uninhabitable. But what followed would redefine the future of the community entirely. In December 1982, federal officials announced that Times Beach posed a significant long-term health risk. The recommendation was clear. Relocation was the safest course of action. For residents, the news arrived not as a dramatic explosion, but as a slow realization. The place they had built lives around was no longer considered safe ground. And yet, for some, leaving would prove more complicated than the contamination itself.
In February 1983, the federal government made its decision official. Under the direction of the Environmental Protection Agency and with funding approved through federal emergency measures, the government would purchase every property in Times Beach. It was one of the largest civilian buyouts in American environmental history at the time. The plan was methodical. Appraisers evaluated homes, offers were extended, residents were given relocation assistance. The message was firm, but not theatrical. Long-term exposure to dioxin carried potential health risks, and remediation at the scale required was not yet feasible. For many families, the choice felt forced by circumstance rather than persuasion. Some left quickly, worried about their children. Others negotiated, reluctant but resigned. Moving trucks began appearing along quiet streets. Curtains disappeared from windows. Lawns went untended. The town did not empty overnight. It faded. Church congregations shrank. The local post office closed. Schools reassigned students. Businesses shut their doors permanently. By 1985, most residents had accepted buyouts, yet a small number remained. Among them was a woman who refused to sign. While officials processed paperwork and demolition schedules advanced, she continued living in a place that maps would soon erase. Her presence was not loud or confrontational. It was simply steady. And as Times Beach grew quieter, her decision became more visible, not as protest, but as persistence. What kept her there would soon define the final chapter of the town itself. By the late 1980s, Times Beach was no longer a functioning municipality. Nearly all of its former 2,000 residents had relocated under the federal buyout program. Homes stood vacant. Street signs remained, but there were few people left to read them. Among the last to leave was a woman who had lived in Times Beach for years and resisted relocation longer than most. Historical accounts describe a small number of residents who hesitated to accept the government's offer, not out of denial of contamination, but out of attachment. For them, the house was not just a structure. It was a record of birthdays, repairs, routines, and memory. Her refusal was quiet. There were no legal battles that reshaped policy, no televised confrontations. She simply continued living there as long as she could, even as municipal services ceased and demolition planning intensified. But time, in this case, was not neutral. By the early 1990s, federal cleanup operations formally began. Soil incineration facilities were constructed to treat contaminated earth collected from Times Beach and other affected sites in Missouri. The town would not be restored. It would be dismantled. Eventually, like the others, she left. Not because she had been convinced, not because the town had recovered, but because the town itself was disappearing. And when the final structures came down, what remained was not a ghost town, but an absence with a history. By the mid-1990s, Times Beach no longer existed as a town. The federal government completed one of the largest soil remediation efforts in U.S. history. Contaminated earth from Times Beach and dozens of other Missouri sites was treated through high-temperature incineration. By 1997, cleanup operations were declared complete, and the land was later redeveloped as Route 66 State Park. Where neighborhoods once stood, there are now walking trails. Where mail was delivered daily, there are informational signs explaining what happened. For former residents, the outcome was complex. The buyout program compensated property owners based on pre-contamination market values, which many viewed as fair. Yet financial reimbursement did not replace what was lost: proximity to neighbors, generational homes, the intangible sense of belonging tied to place. Times Beach became a national reference point in environmental policy. It influenced how federal agencies responded to hazardous waste sites and reinforced the growing authority of the Environmental Protection Agency in managing long-term contamination risks. But policy reform is abstract. Displacement is personal. The woman who refused to leave was not remembered as a symbol of defiance, nor as a political figure. Her story survives quietly within the broader narrative, a reminder that environmental decisions unfold not only on charts and reports, but in living rooms and front yards. And even when land is restored, the memory of a town does not fully dissolve, which raises a deeper question about what we mean when we say a place is gone. Times Beach is often remembered as an environmental case study, a town erased by contamination and federal intervention. But beneath the policy discussions and remediation reports lies something quieter, a question about attachment. What holds a person to a place after its future has been declared over? Is it safety, investment, or memory? The woman who refused to leave did not change the outcome of Times Beach. The town was bought, dismantled, and transformed. But her decision reminds us that relocation is not simply logistical. It is emotional, it is cultural, it is deeply human. Across the United States, communities rise and fall for many reasons: economic shifts, environmental risks, changing priorities. Yet each departure carries a private weight that rarely enters official records. Unseen America exists to explore those quieter dimensions of history, the stories between the headlines. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing. There are many more places across America that vanished from the map, but not from memory. And sometimes what disappears tells us more than what remains.